She accidentally married a billionaire, and he insisted she stay forever. What if one signature could change your entire life? Isabella Reed, a struggling artist trying to save her sick father, never imagined she'd wake up one morning accidentally married to Damien Cross, New York's coldest, most powerful billionaire. But instead of annulling the mistake, he makes a shocking decision. He refuses to let her go. As secrets unravel and hearts collide, what begins as a legal mishap spirals into a whirlwind of passion, betrayal, and unexpected love. Why would a billionaire cling to a marriage born from error? Stay tuned. This story will leave you breathless until the very last second. Before we begin the story, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from, and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss our latest stories. Enjoy the story. The neon lights of Las Vegas blurred against the night sky as laughter, music, and chaos filled the air. Isabella Reed stood on the edge of it all, in the middle of Fremont Street, gripping a plastic cup of sparkling water, while her best friend screamed from the back of a party limo, "Just one more bar, Izzy!" But Isabella, the quiet soul in a group of louder personalities, was done. The flashing lights, the pounding bass, the smell of liquor. It didn't mix well with someone who found peace in books, the quiet rhythm of nature, or late-night journaling by candlelight. She offered a small wave, mouthed, "I'll meet you later," and ducked into the nearest hotel lobby just to breathe. It had been a long year. Her freelance travel writing career was hanging on by a thread. Her rent was overdue, and her younger brother's medical expenses kept piling higher. She hadn't even wanted to come to Vegas for this bachelorette trip. But sometimes, being a good friend meant saying yes, even when everything inside screamed no. Upstairs, in the same hotel, Damien Cross sipped a glass of neat scotch while looking out at the shimmering skyline. His suite, high above the chaos, was a world apart. The noise of the city was a distant murmur here. And yet, he felt no peace. CEO of Crosstech and heir to one of Silicon Valley's oldest fortunes, Damien was a man the media described with words like brilliant, ruthless, and unreachable. At only 35, he'd built an empire out of cold logic, perfect decisions, and an iron will. But none of it helped tonight. Not when his phone had just lit up with a text from his grandfather. "Come home married," or "Don't come home at all." The message wasn't a joke. Damien's grandfather, patriarch of the Cross dynasty, was dying, and his final condition for handing over the company's controlling shares. Damien had to settle down, get married, prove he was capable of more than profit and strategy. Damien scoffed. He didn't believe in marriage, not after watching his father abandon the family, leaving emotional wreckage behind. Love, in his world, was a liability, a temporary distraction with too much power to destroy. But he couldn't afford to walk away from Crosstech either. He needed a solution, fast. Fate, of course, had its own plan. It was just after midnight when Isabella wandered into the hotel bar, her head aching, looking for water and a place to sit. Damien, trying to think through his dilemma, spotted her from across the room. Petite, clearly sober, and alone. She had a journal in one hand and a quiet fire in her eyes. Their eyes met. She raised an eyebrow, half daring him to approach. He did. The conversation was strange from the start. Polite sarcasm, mutual irritation, and then an unexpected thread of ease neither of them anticipated. Two people, with no intention of connecting, found themselves pulled into something too strange to stop. They talked, They drank, just a little. Damien, for the first time in years, laughed. Isabella, tired of always playing it safe, let herself go quiet and still in his presence. It should have ended there. A chance meeting, a spark, and nothing more. But in a bizarre twist of events, including a wedding-themed hotel lounge, a mix-up with two actual newlyweds, and an Elvis impersonator who somehow had access to real marriage licenses, the next morning began with a hangover and a horror story. Isabella sat bolt upright on the edge of the hotel bed, a silver band on her finger. "What is this?" she whispered. Damien stirred, looked at her, and saw the matching ring on his own hand. A quick search. A frantic call to the front desk. A legally binding marriage certificate confirmed their worst suspicion. "I married you?" she gasped. "I don't even know your last name," Damien muttered. For a few seconds, silence filled the suite. Then Damien did the one thing that came naturally. He stood up, adjusted his tie, and said coldly, "Don't worry, I'll fix it." But as they soon discovered, the fix would have to wait. Because that afternoon, when Damien's grandfather called to demand news of his marriage, Damien made a snap decision that would change everything. "I'm married," he said. And when the old man demanded to meet the bride, Damien turned to Isabella and said words she never imagined hearing from a stranger. "You need to pretend to be my wife." The panic that flashed in her eyes was real, but so was the desperation in his, and that's how it began. A marriage that was never meant to happen, between two people who had every reason to walk away. But neither of them could possibly imagine how refusing to let go would change them forever. If you're hooked by this unexpected love story, make sure to hit that subscribe button to support the channel and stay tuned for what comes next. We promise, this journey is just beginning. Isabella Reed had never known what it felt like to be someone's solution until Damien Cross made her one. Hours after the accidental wedding, she stood in the quiet grandeur of Damien's penthouse suite in New York City, staring out over the skyline, asking herself again, how did I end up here? They had flown out of Las Vegas almost immediately after Damien's grandfather insisted on meeting the bride. His team handled everything. A jet, a polished excuse for their sudden exit, and a fabricated backstory of whirlwind romance crafted so precisely it felt like a corporate acquisition. To Damien, that's all it was. Strategy, optics, control. He offered Isabella a contract that same evening. Stay married to him for 6 months, attend a few family functions, pose for a few photos, and he would take care of her brother's mounting medical bills. No questions asked. The folder was sleek, the numbers staggering. 6 months of playing pretend in exchange for a lifetime of financial freedom. Isabella felt the pull of every moral tether she had ever clung to begin to fray. She hated the idea of pretending, of selling a version of herself for the sake of money. But then she thought of her brother, of how many nights he lay awake in pain, of how many calls she'd ignored from creditors, of how hard she'd worked for scraps, and here was a man offering her more than she could ever earn in a decade. "I'll do it," she said, her voice low but steady, "but don't expect me to like it." Damien nodded. "Don't worry. I don't need you to like it. I just need you to follow the rules." The rules. There were many. Public appearances had to be polished. No stepping out of line. No scandal. No emotional entanglements. Their story would be airtight. A love that began with fate, deepened in spontaneity, and led to marriage before they could think twice. What they didn't expect was the firestorm that followed. The press caught wind of the wedding first. Photos from the Vegas chapel leaked. Headlines like "Tech Billionaire Weds Mystery Woman in Midnight Ceremony" splashed across every gossip site and financial blog. Damien's team scrambled to control the narrative, while Isabella's phone exploded with missed calls and panicked messages from her friends, all asking the same question: is it real? Isabella didn't answer any of them. She sat in a room larger than her entire apartment, watching the world spin faster than she could process. Damien was ice cool through it all. He told her what to wear, how to smile, and when to speak. She hated him for how easily he commanded the chaos, for how little he acknowledged that her life was being turned inside out. And yet, in private, he surprised her. He never spoke to her like she was beneath him. He listened when she voiced concerns about her brother. He even asked what kind of books she liked to read. They weren't warm moments, more like slivers of unexpected decency. But in a man like Damien, they felt monumental. Then came the first public event, a gala in Manhattan, hosted by Crosstech. Isabella stepped into the ballroom in a sleek black gown Damien had arranged for her, feeling like a counterfeit. She walked beside him as cameras flashed, hand in hand, a picture of elegance and affection. He whispered instructions just under his breath. "Smile, tilt your head a little. There, perfect." But midway through the evening, something happened. An older woman approached them, sharp-eyed and smiling too sweetly. "You must be Damien's wife," she said to Isabella. "How wonderful! But tell me, how exactly did you two meet?" Isabella froze. She hadn't rehearsed this part, but before she could falter, Damien stepped in. "At an airport," he said smoothly. "She spilled coffee on my shirt. I was furious. She didn't care. I liked that." Isabella glanced at him, startled. That hadn't been part of the plan. But the woman laughed, delighted, and moved on. Later, alone on the rooftop terrace, Isabella turned to Damien. "Why do you say that?" He shrugged, sipping his scotch. "It's better than the original story. Besides, it almost suits you. You seem like the kind of woman who spills coffee and doesn't apologize." She smiled despite herself. Just a flicker. "And you seem like the kind of man who deserves it." He glanced at her then, just briefly, but for the first time, the look wasn't calculating or cold. It was curious, quiet, human. It passed quickly, but in that moment, standing beneath the stars in borrowed clothes and a fake marriage, Isabella wondered if this man, this impossible, infuriating man, was more than the sum of his image. And Damien, though he would never admit it, found himself wondering the same about her. The weeks following the gala blurred into a whirlwind of appearances, photo shoots, and precisely calculated public gestures. Isabella and Damien became a symbol, an enigma of sudden romance and high society fantasy. But inside the walls of Damien's glass-walled penthouse, the reality they lived was anything but a fairy tale. Isabella had begun to adjust to the rhythm of his world. She moved like a ghost through his minimalist mansion, careful not to disturb the silence that seemed to define his life. Everything had a place. His suits were organized by shade, his liquor cart arranged by region, and even the books on his shelves looked untouched, selected more for aesthetic than substance. She noticed things like that. The absence of mess. The absence of life. She, on the other hand, carried warmth with her, even when she didn't try to. She cooked in his immaculate kitchen. Simple dishes, nothing fancy, just the kind of meals she used to make when money was tight, and comfort mattered more than presentation. She didn't ask permission. One night, after a late charity event, Damien returned to find the air filled with the smell of roasted garlic and thyme. "What is that?" he asked, loosening his tie at the door. "Pasta," she said, not looking up. "I was hungry." He paused, staring at the candle flickering in the center of the small kitchen island. She had even found cloth napkins. No one had used the dining area since he'd moved in. "You used my wine," he noted, picking up the nearly empty bottle. "You have 5 more." To his surprise, he sat down. She served without ceremony. They ate in silence, the clinking of forks the only sound between them. He didn't compliment the meal, but when he cleared his plate, she saw the corners of his mouth twitch upward. It wasn't a smile, but it was something. Over the following days, the distance between them didn't exactly shrink, but it began to bend. They found themselves lingering longer in shared spaces. Damien, who once disappeared into his office without a word, now asked how her brother was doing. Isabella, still guarded, replied in curt but honest sentences. One morning, she entered the kitchen to find a steaming mug of coffee waiting on the counter, just the way she liked it. No note, no explanation. That night, as she watched Damien read through a contract with furrowed brows, she asked, "Do you ever stop working?" He didn't look up. "Do you ever stop watching me?" Her cheeks flushed. She opened her book and pretended not to hear him, but the walls they'd built, brick by brick, were starting to crack. The biggest shift came unexpectedly. Isabella had agreed to accompany Damien to a family brunch in the Hamptons, his grandfather's estate, a sweeping property by the ocean with rose gardens and marble statues she felt nervous even looking at. She wore a pale blue sundress that fluttered in the breeze, her hair pinned loosely. Damien noticed, of course, but all he said was, "That works." They arrived to a sea of curious eyes and sharp whispers. The Cross family was wealthy, powerful, and ruthless in their opinions. Isabella was out of place, and everyone knew it. But then, as they walked into the dining hall, Damien reached for her hand. It wasn't part of the script. He didn't let go. For the first time, she felt something shift beneath the pretense. He wasn't performing. He was choosing to stand beside her. The brunch was filled with formalities, and at one point, Damien's aunt, a regal woman with silver hair and an arched brow, leaned across the table and said in a voice meant to carry, "You're different from the women Damien usually entertains." Isabella smiled politely. "I suppose that's a good thing." Damien smirked into his wine glass. Afterward, they walked along the cliffs behind the estate. The sea crashed below, wild and endless. Isabella pulled her shawl tighter. "You handled them better than I expected," Damien said. She glanced sideways. "I'm not made of glass." "No, you're not." His voice was quieter then. She looked up, surprised by the way he was studying her. Not with scrutiny, but with something almost like admiration. "I thought this would be easier," he added, "keeping it all separate. Business, life." "It's not," she replied. "Not when people get involved." He didn't respond, but he didn't look away either. There was something behind his eyes, something searching, something not entirely under his control. That night, back in the city, Damien walked into the kitchen to find Isabella standing at the counter drying dishes. "I don't need you to cook for me," he said, the words sharp but hollow. "I'm not cooking for you," she replied. "I'm cooking for me. If you eat it, that's your choice." He stared at her, jaw clenched, then turned and walked out. But the next morning, she found her plate in the sink, cleaned and drying on the rack. The unspoken language between them deepened with every glance, every silence filled with more meaning than their words could manage. The lines of the contract remained, but both of them knew something else was drawing itself between those lines, something real, raw, and unexpected, and neither of them was ready to name it yet. But they both felt it. The city had started to change with the season. Summer faded, and the crisp edge of autumn slipped into the air. The leaves began to turn, and with them, something subtle shifted between Damien and Isabella. They didn't talk about it, didn't acknowledge it, but it was there, in the way they passed each other in the hall with lingering glances, in the way their hands brushed accidentally, in the silence that began to feel less cold and more comfortable. Still, not everything softened. One late evening, Damien came home unusually late. Isabella had stayed up, sitting by the window, watching the city lights flicker in the distance. When he stepped through the door, his suit was wrinkled, his hair disheveled, and his face unreadable. She could smell the faint trace of whiskey on his breath, though his steps were steady. "I didn't expect you back tonight," she said quietly. He didn't respond right away, just dropped his keys on the console and looked at her. There was something stormy in his eyes, something unresolved. "I ran into an old friend," he finally said, "from college. She asked about my wife." Her fingers tightened around the book in her lap. "And what did you say?" Damien walked to the window, standing beside her but looking out, not at her. "I told her we were doing well." Silence fell between them again. But this time, it wasn't empty. It was heavy with things unsaid. "Are we?" she asked softly. He turned, finally facing her. And for a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something important. But then, the wall came back up. "We're doing what we agreed to," he said. "That's enough." Isabella stood, book forgotten, and stepped toward him. Her voice didn't rise, but it carried something sharper now. "Is it? Because this feels like something else." Damien's jaw flexed. "You're imagining things," but she wasn't. She knew it, and so did he. The tension hung in the room like a wire stretched too tight. Then, before either could say anything more, Damien's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and his expression changed instantly. His face closed off, emotion retreating behind a practiced mask. "I have to take this," he muttered, and stepped into the other room. Isabella stared at the empty space he left behind. That was Damien's way, always on the edge of revealing something real, then retreating into shadow. The next morning, Isabella decided to clear her head. She visited the rooftop garden of a public library nearby, a small oasis above the city. She hadn't been there since her early college days. Sitting on the bench, surrounded by planters of herbs and wildflowers, she breathed deeply, the cool air washing over her. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "You used to sit here with a notebook and scribble poems." She turned to see Elijah, her college friend, and brief high school sweetheart. His easy smile was exactly as she remembered. He sat beside her without asking. "Elijah, wow, it's been years." "Too many," he said. "I saw you at the gala a few weeks ago. Tried to say hi, but you disappeared behind a wall of security and camera flashes." She laughed lightly. "That sounds about right." They talked. About old professors, forgotten dreams, how life had taken strange turns. Elijah had become a creative writing teacher at NYU, still full of stories, still chasing meaning in words. Being with him reminded Isabella of who she used to be before life twisted her path into something unrecognizable. "You look tired," he said gently. "Is the billionaire life not all it's cracked up to be?" She tried to brush it off. It's not exactly mine. It's complicated. He looked at her closely. You don't have to tell me. But if you ever need to talk, really talk, come by campus. Room 403. That night, when she returned to the penthouse, Damien was already home. He was seated on the couch, a glass of bourbon in hand, watching the news, but not really seeing it. You were gone a while, he said without looking at her. I visited the library, she replied. His eyes flicked to her, then back to the screen. Alone? She didn't answer right away. I ran into an old friend, Elijah. His fingers tightened around the glass. I hadn't seen him in years. We caught up, that's all. Damien didn't speak for a long moment. Then quietly, you don't need to explain anything to me. This isn't a real marriage, remember? She walked past him, her voice low but certain. Then stop acting like it matters. She didn't see it, but Damien's face twisted slightly. He took a long sip of his drink and stared at the spot where she had just been standing. In the days that followed, something fractured between them. Not completely, but enough. Their silences became heavier, their conversations shorter. And yet, neither pulled away. Instead, they hovered in that strange in-between space, pretending it didn't hurt, pretending they weren't falling into something deeper than they ever intended. But hearts don't always follow contracts, and both of theirs were already slipping through the cracks. The days after Isabella's encounter with Elijah passed like a slow burn. Nothing exploded, but the tension between her and Damien deepened into something neither of them could ignore. Every glance felt like it carried 1,000 unspoken words. Every silence, once comfortable, now felt like it was holding back something fragile and volatile. Damien buried himself in work. He left early, came back late, and when he was home, he was often locked away in his office, poring over documents that didn't require the kind of intensity he forced into them. But the truth was, he was trying to distract himself from one simple, suffocating realization. He was afraid of what he felt for Isabella. Afraid that what started as an accidental marriage, an impulsive decision forged under alcohol and chaos, had become something he couldn't walk away from. And worse, he didn't know if she felt the same. One evening, Damien came home to find the penthouse dark, except for a soft glow coming from the kitchen. The scent of roasted garlic and basil hung in the air. He walked in to find Isabella at the stove, her hair tied loosely, stirring a pot of pasta sauce with practiced ease. It was a domestic scene, so gentle, so unfamiliar in his world of sterile formality, that he just stood there for a moment, watching. Isabella noticed him and gave a small nod. You skipped lunch again. I figured you'd forget dinner too. Damien stepped closer, taking in the warmth in her tone. Not sweet, not bitter. Just there, present, real. You didn't have to, he murmured. I know, she said simply, but I wanted to. They ate in silence at the long marble table, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that felt full, charged even. Damien found himself stealing glances at her when she wasn't looking, wondering how someone so quietly resilient had slipped into his life and made everything else feel cold by comparison. After dinner, Isabella gathered the plates and moved to the sink, and Damien, without thinking, stood to help her. Their hands met at the faucet, and she froze slightly, their fingers brushing. He didn't pull away. I haven't thanked you, he said softly. For what? For staying. For making this place feel less hollow. Isabella looked at him, her eyes searching. I wasn't trying to do anything grand. I was just trying to survive. Damien nodded slowly. Sometimes that's the bravest thing a person can do. A beat of quiet passed between them. Then, just as gently, Isabella whispered, "Why do you keep pushing me away, Damien? Every time I think I see the real you, you vanish behind some cold, guarded version." He inhaled sharply, caught off guard by her honesty. "Because," he said, voice low, "I'm not used to being seen. Not like this." She didn't respond, just turned off the faucet and dried her hands. "I see you anyway," she said quietly, before walking out of the kitchen. That night, Damien couldn't sleep. Her words echoed in his mind. "I see you." And the terrifying thing was, he wanted to be seen. He wanted to let her in. But opening that door meant confronting everything he'd locked away. His past, his failures, his fears of not being enough. The next day, everything began to unravel. A tabloid article was published online with a headline screaming, "Billionaire Damien Westwood, secretly married, mysterious woman identified." The photos were grainy but clear enough. Isabella exiting a private car with Damien. Another shot of them on the terrace during a business gala. The media had finally caught up, and now the world knew. Damien was furious. He made calls, threatened lawsuits, demanded takedowns. But the story had already gone viral. When Isabella saw the headline, her heart sank. Not from fear of exposure, but from the realization that her life, once private and simple, would never be the same again. She sat in the living room, the article open on her phone, when Damien came storming in. "I'm going to fix this," he growled. "I'll issue a statement. Say it's fake. Say the photos were taken out of context." Isabella looked up at him, calm but resolute. "So you're going to pretend I don't exist?" He froze. "I know this started as an accident," she continued, "and maybe we were both trying to play a part. But this, us, it stopped being fake a long time ago, Damien. At least for me." He stared at her, his defenses wavering. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I won't be hidden. Not anymore. If you're not ready to let the world see me, then maybe you're not ready to see me either." She stood, walked past him, and left him standing there, choking on the truth he'd buried too long. In that moment, Damien realized something crushing. He wasn't afraid of the media or the world knowing. He was afraid of losing her, and he just might have. The silence in the penthouse stretched long after Isabella left the room, her words hanging in the air like smoke. Damien remained motionless in the living room, phone still in hand, the tabloid headline glowing on the screen, mocking him. He had built empires from nothing, negotiated billion-dollar mergers, commanded boardrooms with ease. Yet, here he was, helpless and shaken, brought to his knees not by a scandal, but by a woman who had dared to ask for the one thing he was afraid to give: vulnerability. That night, he didn't sleep. He walked through every corner of the penthouse like a ghost, haunted by the memories of quiet dinners, her laughter from the garden terrace, the way she'd brush her fingers over the piano keys even when she didn't play. The intimacy they had accidentally built through shared silence and small acts of care now felt fragile, breakable, real. By morning, the media frenzy had intensified. Paparazzi now camped outside the building. News vans lined the curb. Every tabloid and financial blog was running with the story. Billionaire Damien Westwood's secret marriage to a mystery woman. Her name was out there now. Her face. Her story. And Damien had done nothing to protect her. not when it mattered most. Isabella, however, didn't seem to be running from it. She refused to hide. Dressed in jeans and a simple white blouse, she stepped out later that morning and walked straight into the chaos, holding her head high. Cameras flashed, questions were hurled, but she said nothing. The only thing she carried was her dignity. Damien watched from the window above, heart clenched. That same fire in her, that pride, was the very thing he'd fallen for, even if he'd never dared admit it out loud. And now he realized he had to choose, not between business and love, not between public image and private truth, but between staying in a prison of his own fear or finally fighting for what he knew he couldn't live without. That afternoon, he did something he never did. He canceled his entire day. No meetings, no calls, no obligations. Instead, he walked out of the building and straight into the sea of flashing cameras. The crowd stilled the moment he appeared. One of the reporters called out, "Mr. Westwood, is it true you secretly married your assistant? Is she after your fortune?" He ignored the question and kept walking, right past the media, down the sidewalk until he reached the street corner. Isabella was there, waiting for a cab, her back to him. "Isabella," he said. She turned. Her eyes were tired, her face unreadable. "I need to talk to you," he said, quieter now, words stripped of their armor. She didn't move. "If it's more damage control, I'm not interested." "It's not," he said. "It's something I should have said the moment you walked into my life." He stepped closer, slow and steady, like a man walking across thin ice. "You said you wouldn't be hidden, that if I couldn't see you, the real you, then I didn't deserve to have you at all. And you were right. I didn't see it then, but I do now." She didn't interrupt, didn't run, just looked at him. "I was a coward," he continued. "Not because I didn't care about you, but because I cared too much. And I thought if I let you in, I'd lose control of everything I'd built. But the truth is, without you, it means nothing." She blinked. Her hands trembled slightly at her sides, but she didn't look away. "I'm not here to apologize in front of cameras," Damien said. "I'm here because I want the world to know the truth, that I married you by accident, that I fell for you by mistake, and that I'd do it all over again, on purpose." For a long beat, the street was silent. The press lowered their cameras. The tension that had coiled around them for weeks seemed to unravel with every breath. Finally, Isabella stepped forward, her voice low but certain. "Then stop hiding," she said. "Not from them, from me." And in that moment, surrounded by flashing bulbs and curious stares, Damien did the one thing no one expected. He took her hand, pulled her gently to him, and kissed her, fully, unreservedly, not like a billionaire shielding secrets, but like a man who had finally found his truth. It was messy. It was public. It was real. And for the first time, neither of them wanted to run. In the days that followed that public declaration, the world watched Damien Westwood and Isabella Monroe with relentless fascination. Headlines ranged from sensational to speculative. Billionaire's kiss that changed everything. From assistant to heart of the empire, and Isabella, the woman who tamed Damien Westwood. But for Damien and Isabella, reality was quieter, more fragile than the flashing lights and spinning narratives. The real work was only beginning. Damien did what no one expected. He stepped back, not from Isabella, but from his empire. For the first time in over a decade, he handed the day-to-day control of Westwood Enterprises to his executive board and began to focus on rebuilding something even more precarious than a billion-dollar business. trust. He rented a modest home just outside the city, nestled in a quiet neighborhood with blooming trees and winding sidewalks, not to hide, but to create space, a neutral ground where he and Isabella could figure out what they wanted without the weight of legacy and luxury pressing on their shoulders. Isabella was hesitant at first. The gesture felt grand, even romantic, but she was wary. Words, even genuine ones, were easy. It was action that proved change. Still, she agreed to visit. They started simple, cooking breakfast together, which Damien was hopeless at. He burned eggs and used salt instead of sugar in pancakes. Isabella laughed more in those mornings than she had in weeks. She taught him to fold laundry properly and teased him when he bought 5 identical pairs of socks because he couldn't be bothered to sort them. There were awkward silences, too. Times when she pulled away without warning, when something he said reminded her of the past hurt, the coldness he once wielded so easily. Damien never pushed. He learned to listen, truly listen. And when she spoke about her fears, about how powerless she'd felt in a world that was never hers to begin with, he didn't offer solutions. He just held space. One afternoon, as the spring sun filtered through the trees and cast long golden shadows across the backyard, Isabella sat on a blanket reading, while Damien tinkered with a grill he clearly didn't know how to use. She glanced up, watching him struggle with the propane tank, his expression a mix of pride and frustration. She smiled, then froze, realizing how natural it felt, how safe. Later, as they sat under the stars, he turned to her and said, "I'm not trying to win you back. I'm trying to earn the right to stand beside you." That night, Isabella kissed him, not out of pity, not because the world was watching, but because, for the first time, her heart wasn't guarded. It was curious again, open. They spent the following weeks rediscovering each other. Damien showed her corners of his life she'd never known. The music he played late at night when no one was around. The way he used to draw as a kid, but gave it up when business school took over. Isabella shared her dreams. The book she'd started writing before everything changed. The desire to create something that was hers alone, not bound to anyone else's legacy. It was not perfect. They argued. There were days when doubts returned like ghosts. But each time, instead of retreating into silence, they leaned in. They fought fairly. They forgave more easily. Damien no longer spoke in statements. He asked questions. Isabella no longer braced herself for disappointment. She allowed space for growth. In the midst of this quiet transformation, the outside world continued to clamor for updates, interview requests, brand deals, even offers to turn their story into a film flooded in. Damien ignored them all. Isabella turned down every media pitch, every publisher trying to capitalize on her name. "This story," she told Damien one night, "belongs to us." Then one morning, as they sat with coffee on the porch, Damien slid a thin envelope across the table. "What's this?" she asked, sipping. "A deed," he said, "to this house, in your name. No strings, no expectations, just something that's yours, even if you walk away tomorrow." Her fingers trembled as she opened it, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then quietly, "You still don't get it." He stiffened slightly. "What do you mean?" "I don't want the house, Damien," she said. "I want to know that if I leave, if I fall apart, you won't disappear. That this version of you, this honest, vulnerable man, isn't temporary." He looked at her then, truly looked, and nodded. Then stay as long as you need, and even if you go, I'll be right here. And for the first time, Isabella didn't feel like she had to run, because she wasn't just seen. She was safe, and the man who had once been a stranger in her life was slowly becoming home. That summer arrived gently, like a whispered promise of peace. The days were long and warm, filled with quiet routines and unexpected laughter. Isabella and Damien began to exist not as two people cautiously testing the waters, but as two souls settling into a rhythm that felt almost natural, almost inevitable. One Sunday morning, as the soft hum of cicadas echoed beyond the garden fence, Isabella opened the window to find the aroma of fresh bread drifting in from the kitchen. Damien, still in pajamas and flour on his cheek, was carefully pulling a golden brown loaf from the oven, a recipe he'd spent weeks trying to perfect. She leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, watching him fumble with oven mitts and mutter under his breath about baking times and crust color. "You've officially been domesticated," she said with a smirk. He turned to her, grinning. "I prefer to think of it as reformed." They shared breakfast on the porch, the bread still warm between their fingers, their legs stretched out under the rising sun. Isabella told him about the characters in the novel she'd returned to writing, and he listened genuinely, attentively. It was the kind of intimacy that didn't need grand gestures. It was found in silence, in sharing morning light, in knowing the other person's rhythms before they even spoke. But beneath the quiet, life still moved forward. The world hadn't forgotten who Damien Westwood was, nor had the board of Westwood Enterprises. They'd grown restless in his absence, anxious about the company's direction and eager to reassert structure. His assistant, Colin, arrived one afternoon with a portfolio full of pressing matters, legal documents, potential takeovers, media rumors. Damien barely glanced at the pages before pushing them aside. "Tell them to wait," he said. Colin frowned. "They're threatening to vote you out as CEO." Isabella overheard the conversation as she walked in with a pitcher of lemonade. She paused, silent for a moment. Then, "Maybe it's time you went back." Damien looked at her, startled. "Why would I do that? I'm right where I want to be." She set the pitcher down slowly. "You didn't build Westwood Enterprises just to walk away. And the man I'm falling in love with, he doesn't run from responsibility. He builds things better than anyone else." He was quiet for a long moment. "I'm afraid that if I step back into that world, I'll lose who I've become." "You won't," she said softly, "because this version of you, it isn't new. It's always been there. It just needed someone to remind you of it." So Damien returned, not to reclaim a throne, but to reshape the kingdom. He stepped into the boardroom with a calm fire in his chest, not as the ruthless tycoon they once feared, but as a man who had rediscovered purpose beyond profit. He announced sweeping internal changes, fairer wages, wellness programs for employees, mentorship initiatives for young talent. Some laughed, some opposed, but most listened, because this wasn't just a man in love. It was a man transformed. Meanwhile, Isabella found her own strength blooming in unexpected ways. She was offered a publishing deal from a respected house in New York, not because of her proximity to Damien, but because her manuscript, The Edge of Silence, had moved the editor to tears. She nearly declined. The idea of leaving the life they were building, even briefly, terrified her, but Damien didn't hesitate. "Go," he said. "Your story deserves to be heard, And so she left for 2 weeks, her first time apart from him since everything began. They spoke every night, voices low and intimate over the phone, like two teenagers in love for the first time. When she returned, it wasn't to fanfare or flowers. It was to Damien, waiting at the gate in his favorite sweater, holding 2 mugs of cocoa and a shy smile. "I missed you," he said simply. And in that moment, she knew. They weren't just surviving love. They were building something that could last, something real. But there was still one chapter neither of them had opened yet, one door they hadn't dared to approach, the one marked with the memory of their first accidental vows, the marriage that began it all. That door was about to open, and this time, not by accident. The afternoon light filtered gently through the windows of their shared cottage, casting long golden streaks on the polished hardwood floors. Isabella stood near the fireplace, her fingers trailing over the spine of an old leather-bound book. Though the quiet of the room was peaceful, her heart beat with a new kind of restlessness, a yearning not born of doubt, but of clarity. She was no longer the woman swept into a billionaire's world by accident. She had found her voice, her purpose, and she had grown into someone who wanted to choose her life, not fall into it. Damien entered the room with a quiet presence, watching her for a moment before speaking. "You've been quiet today," he said softly. She turned to him, her brown eyes steady. "I've been thinking." His brows rose slightly, a touch of concern in his expression. "About what?" "About us," she said. "About how we started. How everything between us was born out of a mistake, and how somehow it turned into everything." He stepped closer, hands in his pockets, sensing there was more. "I want us to get married," she said, her voice even, but her eyes filled with something deeper, something vulnerable and brave. "Not because a license was misplaced, or because we were cornered by circumstance. I want to stand before you, willingly. I want to say yes with my whole heart." Damien's chest rose with a sharp breath. He hadn't expected those words, not today. For months, he'd been the one chasing redemption, rebuilding what his pride had fractured. But now, in this quiet room, she was offering him a new beginning. "You're asking me?" he said, his lips curving gently. "I guess I am," she replied with a soft laugh. He closed the distance between them and took her hands in his. "Then my answer is yes, and I'll ask you back, just to make sure it's official. Isabella Grace Bennett, will you marry me? Again, but this time, for real. And forever?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." The following weeks were a whirlwind of simple yet meaningful preparations. They didn't want opulence, no media, no extravagant floral arrangements, no designer gowns flown in from Paris. They wanted something honest, intimate. They chose the hillside meadow behind the house, where wildflowers bloomed freely under the open sky, as the place where they would say their vows. When the day came, the weather felt like a blessing. Sunlight soft and skies clear. Isabella wore a flowing ivory dress she'd sewn touches into herself, lace from her late mother's scarf stitched into the hem. Damien wore a tailored gray suit, understated but elegant, his cufflinks engraved with the date of their first accidental wedding. A handful of their closest friends and family gathered. Among them were Colin, Damien's loyal assistant who had supported him through every change, and Mary, the kind florist who had once offered Isabella work when she had nowhere to turn. As the music played, Isabella walked barefoot through the grass, each step steady, each breath full of joy. Damien met her halfway, and when their eyes met, nothing else in the world existed. He took her hand and kissed it gently before they turned to face the officiant. The vows they exchanged were not rehearsed or read from a script. They were spoken from the soul. "I didn't know what love meant," Damien said, his voice thick with emotion. "Not until I met you. You taught me that love isn't control or power or possession. It's kindness, patience, sacrifice. It's laughter in the dark and holding hands through the storm. You made me a better man. And I promise to spend the rest of my life never forgetting that." Isabella's voice trembled as she began. "You were the last person I ever expected to love. You came into my life like a storm, and I tried to run, but you stayed. You fought for me, even when I pushed you away. You taught me that vulnerability isn't weakness, that love can come from the most unlikely places and grow stronger with time. I promise to always see you, truly see you, and to never take a single day we have for granted." When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, it felt like the first time, yet infinitely more powerful. They kissed under the open sky, with cheers ringing around them, and the scent of wild lavender drifting on the breeze. That night, as the stars emerged over their quiet home, they sat wrapped in a single blanket on the porch, sipping tea and watching the moonlight bathe the world in silver. Damien whispered, "You know, marrying you by accident might have been the best mistake I ever made." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "And saying yes, twice, might just be the bravest thing I've ever done." In that quiet, they knew, with certainty, that their love was no longer a product of coincidence. It was a choice, a promise, a forever. The years that followed their heartfelt second wedding unfolded not as a fairy tale with golden crowns and spotless ease, but as a beautifully imperfect love story rooted in growth, understanding, and the quiet power of commitment. For Damien and Isabella, the accidental marriage that once began as an administrative error had blossomed into the truest decision of their lives. After their wedding beneath the wildflower-strewn meadow, Damien made good on the promises he whispered under the open sky. He scaled back his responsibilities at West Haven Holdings, handing over the day-to-day operations to a trusted team and choosing to lead with intention, not obsession. The towering glass office with its skyline view became a part-time setting in his life. The rest of his time? It was spent at the little house in the Berkshires, where laughter filled the kitchen and the smell of bread baking became his new kind of success. Isabella, now no longer the woman who once barely scraped by on waitress wages, didn't transform overnight into a socialite or heiress. She didn't want to. Instead, she found her own rhythm again. She returned to school part-time, completing the degree she had once been forced to abandon, and later began working with a nonprofit focused on educational access for underprivileged youth. She carried her past with her, not as baggage, but as a map, a reminder of where she had been and why her future mattered. They traveled together, not to escape, but to experience. Damien, who had once measured his worth in net gains and media mentions, now found joy in quiet mornings with coffee and crossword puzzles. They hiked through the forests of Vermont, explored the vineyards of Sonoma, and once, in a spontaneous decision, ended up lost in a small fishing town in Portugal, laughing in the rain while looking for shelter. There was freedom in not having to be perfect anymore, but life, as it always does, brought its trials too. A few years into their marriage, Isabella's mother fell gravely ill. They returned to her hometown to care for her, and during that time, Isabella crumbled under the weight of grief and responsibility. Damien, instead of retreating into logic and solutions, did the one thing she had once begged of him. He stayed, quietly, patiently, through sleepless nights and hospital corridors, through moments where words were useless. He was simply there. Later, when Damien's company suffered a public setback, an investment gone wrong, press swirling with rumors of incompetence, Isabella did not ask him to explain. She didn't demand he fix it. She handed him a cup of tea, sat beside him, and whispered, "Even if the world turns its back, you still have mine." And he believed her. Their marriage wasn't built on grand declarations, not anymore. It was built on dishes washed late at night, on notes left by the coffee machine, on hugs in hallways after arguments, and kisses on foreheads when one of them was too tired to speak. Eventually, they welcomed a daughter, Elena, with Isabella's eyes and Damien's quiet intensity. Becoming parents tested them in new ways. Sleepless nights, uncertainty, learning how to co-parent while still being lovers and friends. But they faced it the way they faced everything else, together, with grace when they could manage it, and forgiveness when they fell short. As Elena grew, she would often ask her parents how they met. Isabella would smile and glance at Damien, who would reply, "Well, sweetheart, I married your mom by accident, and then refused to let her go." Elena would laugh, thinking it a joke, but for them, it was the truest story ever told. One spring afternoon, on the anniversary of their second wedding, Damien brought Isabella to the same meadow. It had changed over the years, wilder, less tamed, yet the flowers still bloomed freely. He knelt once more in the grass, this time with a delicate necklace, a charm shaped like a paper ring, the symbol of the paperwork error that had brought her into his life. "No matter how many years go by," he said, "I will always choose you again, even if it starts with a mistake." Isabella's eyes welled with tears, the years folding into that moment like pages of a book well read. "And I'll keep saying yes," she replied, placing the charm around her neck, "because loving you has never been the mistake. It's been the miracle." They stood there in the breeze, two people who had weathered life not with perfection, but with perseverance. And that, more than any fortune or fame, was their greatest triumph. The love story of Damien Cross and Isabella Reed is not one of perfection or predictability. It's one of transformation. What began as an administrative error, a signature misplaced on a form, became the most unexpected blessing either of them could have imagined. Two people from completely different worlds. He, a billionaire business magnate shaped by power and performance, and she, a resilient woman forged in hardship, were bound by accident, but held together by choice. Through every trial, misunderstandings, past wounds, emotional distance, and external pressures, they learned that love isn't a destination, but a decision made every single day. Damien had to let go of his ego, of the need to control and impress, to become the man Isabella truly needed. Isabella, once guarded and self-reliant to the point of pain, had to learn how to lean into vulnerability, to accept love not just as a lifeline for survival, but as something she deserved. Their story teaches us that love doesn't have to start perfectly to become something perfect. Real love is forged in the fire of adversity, shaped not by grand gestures, but by small, consistent acts of care, presence, and accountability. From cooking a simple meal, to kneeling in front of a crowded gala, to giving up multi-million-dollar deals for someone's well-being. These moments, though quiet, spoke volumes. Over the years, they built not just a relationship, but a life, a garden of shared memories, laughter, losses, and triumphs. They redefined what success meant. For Damien, it was no longer about acquisitions, but about being there to tuck his daughter into bed. For Isabella, it was no longer about simply surviving, but about living fully, with purpose, passion, and love. The deep life lesson. This story reminds us that life will not always hand us perfect beginnings. Sometimes, the very things that seem like mistakes are the doors to the greatest chapters of our lives. Whether it's a job you didn't plan to take, a person you never thought you'd meet, or a place you never expected to stay, life has a way of surprising us. What matters is not how we start, but how we grow. In a world that often idolizes overnight success and fairy tale love, the story of Damien and Isabella brings us back to what's real. Love is earned, nurtured, forgiven, and rediscovered. And sometimes, holding on through the storm is what leads us to the most beautiful sunrise. Now, we want to hear from you. If you were in Isabella's shoes, would you have taken a chance on Damien again? A. Yes. Everyone deserves a second chance if they're truly willing to change. B. No. Some mistakes are too deep to forgive. Drop your answer below in the comments. A or B. Also, what do you think? Can love really change a person? Have you ever seen someone transform because of love, or experienced it yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice might inspire someone else today. And if this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like, share with a friend who needs a little hope, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep creating more meaningful stories just like this one. Let's continue to believe in the power of love. No matter how it begins,